mystery that baffled Australia. Carol Clay and Russell Hill, elderly lovers, killed and then set on fire while camping in Victoria's high country 5 years ago. Former Jetstar pilot Greg Lynn was eventually charged, and after a Supreme Court trial, he was found guilty by a jury of Carol's murder, but acquitted of killing Russell. Lynn claimed it was an accident during a scuffle with Russell in the bush. Today, the biggest twist yet. He won an appeal. Lynn's murder conviction and that 32-year jail sentence sensationally quashed. Defence lawyer Ruth Parker has worked on some of the country's most high-profile cases. Ruth, today's decision, did it come as a shock to you?
Well, no. After viewing the Court of Appeal proceedings where the arguments were read out, there was clearly some very problematic behaviour by the prosecutor that contravened the rules of fairness that are integral to a criminal trial. And today, those contraventions were identified and read out in the judgment of the Court of Appeal, and they have said that those problematic comments, the lack of fairness, created a substantial miscarriage of justice, and therefore the conviction was unsafe.
As I think, hearing this today, there was just this reaction of, how can a case go from Greg Lynn, you are guilty of murder, jailed for 32 years, to, no, scrap that and start over?
Well, the Court of Appeal exists to provide a reset when things go wrong. We live in a system of justice where if we can identify that something went wrong in your trial that gave rise to a substantial miscarriage of justice, they can overturn your conviction and reset the balance so that you stand trial again, if, of course, the director elects to put you up on trial again. But really what they identified today were fundamental unfairness in the way that the prosecutor conducted the matter. And those were things that just could not be corrected without a new trial.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just looking at here then, so this is really like a technicality of the law, right? Prosecution accused of not conducting the trial properly. When the Court of Appeal then calls for a retrial, and that is for the murder charge of Carol Clay only, is that likely to happen?
Well, that is in the hands of the director, and it's an interesting case. In Victoria, we've had a few interesting cases this year. But in this case, this was a double murder. A prosecution theory was put forward. Now, clearly the jury rejected that the second killing was murder. They accepted that it was potentially self-defence, or they couldn't be satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt that it was not, but then found that the murder of Miss Clay was in fact an unlawful killing, a murder. And now he will only stand trial, if he does stand trial, in relation to the murder of Miss Clay. And I think it's going to be fascinating because he gave evidence and was cross-examined, and the questions or the lack of questions that were put to him were the fundamental basis upon which the Court of Appeal overturned his conviction. Now, because he's given evidence, he actually doesn't need to give evidence again. So it's going to be interesting to see what the prosecution case actually looks like on one murder where he doesn't have to give evidence and be cross-examined again unless he wants to.
Oh, goodness me. It just all sounds tricky, right? Because, and just to go back sort of through the case, of course, Greg Lynn, he's 59. He said this was all an accident. There was a fight. Carol Clay was accidentally shot, and then Russell Hill fell on a knife. There were no witnesses. So, what are then the challenges with a case like this?
Oh, it's extremely challenging. And look, it's not unusual in murder matters for there to be no witnesses. But in this case, like other cases, particularly cold cases, there's issues with evidence being either intentionally destroyed or destroyed by the elements. We see issues with trying to reopen an examination of ballistics, of DNA, of fingerprints. And in this case in particular, there were criticisms of the way the prosecution cherry-picked the ballistics evidence that they led. And in fact, under cross-examination by Mr. Lynn's legal team, it opened up a range of possibilities that did leave open the fact that she could have been accidentally killed. And that was another aspect that the Court of Appeal criticised of the prosecution, which was, in essence, cherry-picking the evidence they liked that fit whatever theory they had. But that's not the role of a prosecutor. The role of a prosecutor is to put the prosecution case fairly and let the jury decide.
What if the prosecution then decides not to push ahead with a new trial? What will happen then, Ruth?
He'll be released.
And that's it. And look, he's locked up at the moment. The case won't be back in court until the new year. Could he apply for bail in the meantime?
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of bail for murder, the test is that you have to satisfy the court that there are exceptional circumstances which justify a grant of bail. Now, in circumstances where you're charged with 2 murders, it's basically impossible to get bail. But in this case, charged with 1 murder, in circumstances where he may be able to point to some real weaknesses in the prosecution case, he has a prospect of being granted bail. And in fact, the Court of Appeal foreshadowed today that whilst he was remanded in custody, he was remanded in custody for so long as until he is granted bail, if he is granted bail.
And you know who I just really feel for at the moment? The families of Carol and Russell and all of this, now facing another possible trial. That's so hard.
Look, criminal trials, they are brutal processes. And nobody goes into court, particularly for a murder trial, and particularly when you've got victims' families, taking it anything less than extremely seriously. But that is also why you have to do it fairly. Because when you don't, you put these people through it again.
Yeah.
So in circumstances where he is going to be retried, the rules of fairness dictate that you have to play within the rules. Because if you don't, not only do you have to come back to court if the Court of Appeal overturns your conviction, but everybody who has had to go through it will have to go through it again.
Yep, and everything you say there makes sense, but it's still really hard for them. Appreciate your time, Ruth. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, up next, we're going to have something a little